Since Donald Trump was elected, I always wanted to speak with a right-wing conservative and understand how they see politics and the US. And this is what I'm doing in this episode. I ask a lot of questions. I wish I would have had more time to debate every single topic, and you will see that we touched on many things. We talk about Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis. We talk about January 6th. We speak about slavery and Native American, and whether America needs reconciliation. We talk about federalism and the growing tension between the states and federal power. We talk about David work as he lobbied for Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, and the influence of figures like Elon Musk in politics and leadership. Right. So this conversation is not an endorsement of David's views. My goal in doing this interview was to engage in a meaningful dialogue to better understand the force shaping Americans' division today. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I am looking forward to your comments. Thank you. Today we are speaking with David Reaboi, national security expert, media analyst, and political commentator. Known as a right-wing Twitter pugilist, David's work spans political warfare, influence, operation, and national security. He's never backed down from controversy, and today we will explore the ideas that drive his work and spark debate. Welcome to Back in America, David.
It's my pleasure to be with you.
I want to start from the beginning so that we really understand who you are. I've read that you've got Hungarian Jewish ancestry. You grew up in the Northeast of the US. Tell us about your childhood and the household you grew up in.
I'm a first-generation American. Both of my parents came from Transylvania. They were Jews who spoke Hungarian at home, so they were ethnically Hungarian. In a place that was mixed. For a while, it was mixed German, Hungarian, and Romanian. And then over the years, it turned to be more Hungarian or Romanian. And then finally, really after the Trianon Treaty, after the First World War, it ended up in as part of Romania. And it's disputed by Hungarians, but it is part of Romania. So they came from communist Romania. They settled here in the 1960s in New Jersey into a community of Hungarian Jews from Transylvania. And they had me. So that was the environment in which I grew up. Politically, my family was comprised of Reagan Democrats and folks who were very committed to fighting the Cold War. Folks who understood that evil is a real thing and there are horrible regimes out there. We grew up in a very patriotic environment. And so supporting John Kennedy, supporting Nixon, supporting Reagan, but still as Democrats. And then finally, once Reagan was elected, they all formally flipped over. So that was the environment that I grew up in. I grew up always hearing about the Holocaust from my grandfather, who was an Auschwitz survivor. Most of his family died in the Holocaust. And so that was really an ever-present thing. While my peers around me who were more American didn't have that experience, I grew up fascinated by all of this, and it led me to study Marxism, Leninism, and totalitarian movements, obviously from an adversarial point of view. But I always thought that knowing more about the enemy is better than knowing less. So that's been the guiding principle of my career.
What did you speak at home?
Hungarian, and as time went on, as my grandparents got older and passed away, a combination of Hungarian and English.
And you still speak Hungarian?
I do.
Yeah. What did your parents do?
What did my parents do? My father is in the kosher meat business, and my mother is a retired therapist.
I read that you've got an interest in design, in music, in Islam, even in bodybuilding. Yet it seemed that politics is really your calling. When did you realize that politics was your thing? You said that coming from this background, you were fighting the enemy. Do you recall how young you were when you said gosh, politics is my thing.
I had a neighbor back in the day. We used to watch the Iran Contra hearings together. This was probably 1988. I was fascinated with it. I campaigned for Reagan in 84 in my Jewish school. It's been a lifetime's concern. As you get older, things change. My opinions in general haven't changed all that much. The basic lodestar is still pointed in the same direction. When I went off to college, I went to George Washington University. I wanted to be in DC and I got a degree in international affairs. Russian and Eastern European history was my minor. So that was still a great interest. But at the time, it was the 90s and the world was very different. It was pre 9/11. It was a world where, to be honest with you, completely ridiculous conversations were taking place and the conventional wisdom was just nonsense. I remember very clearly that Thomas Friedman's the Lexus and the olive tree were very much in vogue. I was rebelling against my international law professor because I thought international law as a concept was completely ridiculous. They would look at me, all my colleagues and the professors, and say, "What are you, a Neanderthal?" But I said I was very confident that reality would reassert itself, and it ended up reasserting itself. At the same time, I was studying abroad in Budapest. It was after the fall of the Soviet Union. The Cold War had ended. All of Eastern Europe was going through a trend of privatization, trying to figure out how to incorporate some of these freedoms into their society that had once been behind the Iron Curtain. Seeing that was a wake-up call for me because it was very obvious that the idea of history had not been settled. Everyone was not, in fact, in agreement that Western liberal democracy was the final end result and the perfect form of government for everyone. I was in ninth grade with a very hip history teacher, and she taught us a book called Clash of Civilizations by Sam Huntington. And this would have been in 1993 or maybe 1994 at the latest. This was an extremely hip thing to give to kids. I should have probably been fired today for doing so, but that book was something we spent the entire year discussing and looking at world history through the lens of that. That kind of prepared me for not really buying into the absurd consensus of the 90s at the time.
We start to get a picture of where you come from, how you got your interest into politics. I want to jump to today and the current political situation. When did you realize that Trump was going to be reelected? And what sort of sign made you understand that, yes, he is going to be reelected?
To be honest with you, I was not confident that was going to be the case until it happened. And even when it happened, I didn't believe it. I have a reputation as a bit of a doomer who sees the black cloud in everything.
And you, right?
I just assumed, as a friend of mine says, I'm not a pessimist, I'm a realist. And I just assumed that they wouldn't let him win. I just assumed that they would find as many ballots as they need. But to my great surprise and pleasure, I was wrong. And Trump did win. And so that's been a really great surprise for me. To be honest, I think that I, as well as a lot of the other doomers, need to take stock and say, okay, we admit we were wrong. And that things are not so bleak in terms of the all-powerful Democrats and their all-powerful vote-generating machine and things like that. I certainly deserve to be humbled in that particular respect. And I'm happy to be, considering the Trump won.
And yet you haven't supported Trump in the past.
I supported Trump very strongly from 2016 and up until the primary. When I supported Ron DeSantis, I thought that he was the better man for the job. The primary voters disagreed, but there was never a moment when I wouldn't support Trump in the general.
Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
What made you go with DeSantis at the time?
I live in Florida and I saw firsthand what DeSantis is capable of. What DeSantis had that Trump didn't have was discipline, follow through, and strong executive leadership. I feel that's part of what plagued the first Trump administration. I thought DeSantis could do a better job in that respect. I've always been ideologically right wing. In DeSantis, I saw a kindred spirit. I saw someone who wouldn't be fooled by people telling him this appointment is good or this particular policy is good. He's someone that doesn't need to be told and has very strong opinions about these things himself. I like that he comes from a strong right-wing intellectual tradition. That was my rationale, being a Floridian and seeing firsthand what he did with COVID, but not just COVID. His whole approach to the use of executive power is exactly what I think America needs. That's why I supported him.
Tell us more about that.
So the easiest way to say it is that DeSantis rejects this idea of a value neutral application of the law, for example. And he understands that at the end of the day, the politics is there to reward your friend and to punish your enemies so that people will want to be your friend and not your enemy. In case after case, DeSantis was doing this. He was doing this with Disney. He was doing this with many other things. And he was just scoring win after win. He didn't take no for an answer. And his actions were so legally well thought out that he would always end up winning in court as well. So it was a matter of preparation also. But at the end of the day, DeSantis was a rebuke to a kind of libertarian approach to politics that had, to my mind, done kind of terrible things to the right, which is to say that on a whole host of issues, we say, you know what? The state has no compelling interest in this issue. It's up to the people. And I think DeSantis is not that kind of guy. He understands that at the end of the day, the state absolutely has a compelling interest in things like the sexualization of educational materials and putting a stop to that. For example, when DeSantis took aim at Disney, Nikki Haley and even Donald Trump couldn't understand what he was doing. And they said, wait a minute, Disney does so many jobs, let them do what they want. And DeSantis said, no, we're going to make them pay a cost for doing what they're doing with the woke stuff and pushing the woke stuff on kids. Whereas every other Republican would have just said, you know what, we'll take big business's money and that's it. DeSantis I think he saw the bigger picture.
All right. So you just spoke about the woke stuff, and I want to come back to that. But that brings me to a question I had about when you speak about the national divorce. It comes to me as your vision is that America is so polarized that unity between the left and the right, or the Democrat and the Republican, is not possible. Do you see it leveraging away, or how do you see this conflict being resolved?
I see it being resolved one way or the other in a kind of terrible way in which the United States collapses. I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow. I don't think it's going to happen next week or next year, but nothing lasts forever. And all empires fall for the same reason, which is the fact that they're overstretched and they encompass too many kind of competing ideas about the nature of the good and the nature of justice and the most basic philosophical things. And that's the situation that America finds itself in today. The left likes to talk about the American empire, and some folks on the right now too. They talk about the American empire all around the world. But at the end of the day, we are an empire, even if we stay on our shores. We're a continent-sized country that encompasses people as diverse as Maine, Texas, Washington State, Florida, and Arkansas. And at some point, the things that divide us will far outnumber the things that unite us. And I think, frankly, we're there. And
no, it struck me that, as you say, America is a big country. You've got a lot of people living in this country. And the fact that we don't all agree is okay. It's part of politics. But where you seem to go is that the disagreement is so big that we cannot live together any longer. And I'm not sure that's true. Coming from France, looking at America, looking at the flag, looking at what unites this country, the Pledge of Allegiance, the fact that you've got so many people coming together from different horizons to make this America. Being American is something which is possible even if you were not born in America. Try to be German, try to be French, try to be Spanish if you weren't born Spanish. It's a totally different story. So I still believe that, especially seeing America from my eyes of a European, I don't know if you're that divided in the end.
I think the comparison is incorrect. The more apt comparison is not to compare the US with France, but to compare the US with Europe. So imagine the EU as a governing body, a unified Europe. That would be far more contentious. Yes, you absolutely have things that you would agree on, for sure, just like we do in the United States. But there are other things that are unresolvable. And the founders of the United States knew this. Even with 13 original states, they understood this. And the thing they figured out was federalism, which says the federal government can do these X number of things. Everything else is left up to the states, because they understood that most laws, the part of government that would interface most closely with the citizens of the United States would be their state governments, not their federal governments. Now, over the years, the idea of the federal government, specifically in the last 120, 140 years or so, has ballooned with the rise of progressivism on purpose, with the express purpose of overriding the will of the people in these states. And so what you have is a federalism that doesn't really work the way our founders intended, in a way that would allow for the release of tension. It would allow for one state to have one particular policy based on its politics and convictions, and another state to do the opposite thing. But really what you've had, and it's not just the progressive movement, it's also mass media and a whole bunch of other things. But now we're in 2024. It's not, there's very little agreement. Let's say with the left, there's very little agreement about federalism as such. For example, on abortion, the last Supreme Court decision, Dobbs left abortion policy up to the states, which most folks on the right thought it properly should be. Immediately, the Democrats want to federalize that issue. There's no issue they don't want to federalize, because the way the way they look at every issue, frankly, is through the lens of civil rights, because it's advantageous to them politically. You can't have an issue of civil rights being decided by the states. So then we get back to the same conflict, which is that the right wants more local representation and the left wants more federal representation, so long as they're the ones in charge. And sure, that can go on and has gone on for the last 50 years in the United States, maybe more. We're getting to the point where it's going to exhaust itself as more issues fall underneath the left's banner of civil rights. So this is the conflict. I wish we could have a situation where we have true federalism, where one state could decide to do X, and the other state could decide to do Y, and then we say, live and let live. But unfortunately, that's not the environment, the political environment that we live in. And I don't think that's coming back.
Talking of this political violence, I read in one of your pieces that you've written in 2021 that you said violence might arise from political rhetoric. And then in a recent Substack article, you suggested a similar trajectory. Critics might say that you're actually fueling the very unrest that you predict. What do you say to that?
By warning,
By predicting this coming of violence,
that would be really rich, coming from the same people who believe that the greatest terrorist threat is domestic extremism. Therefore, we must control the speech of American citizens. I don't think it's a legitimate position to say that warning against political violence is the same as advocating for it. If that was the case, then everybody at CNN, MSNBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Republic would be jailed, would be guilty of the same thing for predicting that fascism would descend and Trump is Hitler. It's going to put everybody in camps. It's completely ridiculous. The point that I made in my last piece at Substack is that we always operated with the assumption that explicit Hitler and Nazi comparisons were the third rail. They were beyond the pale, because beyond which there's really nothing. It exhausts the political rhetorical universe. I'm not sure where you can go after that. If you're accusing your political opponent of being Hitler, of being a Nazi, of wanting to exterminate their opponents, the most rational thing would be, okay, join a terrorist group, do targeted assassinations, do whatever you can, set the country on fire. That would be the rational thing to do. But I don't think that's the case. I think it's a highly irrational, completely insane comparison to make. That's where the fault lies. The fault isn't in me warning that these guys are saying crazy stuff. It's the guys who are saying crazy stuff.
And so you still believe that what you call the Antifa may take to the street and engage in political violence?
Oh, for sure. It's not theoretical and it's not new. Many of us have seen it on the streets of Paris. Violence is something that is in the doctrinal toolkit of the folks who self-identify as Antifa and who trace their lineage ideologically and organizationally to that movement. But I believe that there is a logic governing how they act. My assessment was that they did not pop off after the election this time, because Trump's win was just too big. From their point of view, they like to be in the position of the majority. They like to cloak their particular violent actions in a slipstream of what could be called mostly peaceful civil rights protests. They are the tip of the spear when it comes to those types of movements, as opposed to just random anarchists that pop off.
I hear you. And yet, what do you make of January 6th?
In what way?
I mean, I don't think the left has ever attacked democracy like the right has.
Can you unpack that?
Or stepping on the Capitol to disrupt peaceful election, that's not really what you call democracy, right?
The left has broken into the Capitol many times. Folks on the left have tried to blow up the Capitol, as a matter of fact, several times in the last several decades. I think unpacking that to get to precisely what you're saying is important, because I think it's a rhetorical trick that a lot of the left likes to use, and frankly, the Democrats, by synonymizing their particular agenda with the word democracy. Like you did in your question. Do I think that January 6th was a stupid, ill-advised expression of impotent rage? Yes. Do I think that it was the worst thing in the world? No, of course not. I don't think it changed anything. I don't think it was in danger of changing anything. I don't think that anyone serious believes that they would have taken over the United States or done anything that had any lasting or even medium-term impact at all. It's basically a bunch of hooligans who are angry and did some mischief. Now, the people who are violent, I think, should be punished the way any violent protesters are punished. But in the case of January 6th, the law really has come down hard on many people who, frankly, did nothing wrong other than to follow folks into a building and walk around. And those people have been hounded. They've lost their livelihoods. Many of them have had the weight of the Department of Justice thrown down on them. Many of them have lost their homes and their families. Some have lost their lives for not really doing a tenth of what some of the Antifa folks did in the summer of 2020. So if you have an equal application of the law, I'm all for it. It was only a few months before January 6th that an attorney was arrested for throwing a Molotov cocktail into a police car in New York City. Now, do I think that's a more serious offense than someone who was there on January 6th and didn't break through or didn't break anything and just followed a crowd through the Capitol building? Of course I do. I think you'd be crazy not to. That attorney got off. And that attorney was well connected with the Obama administration and with the Department of Justice, and that attorney got off. And so you have many cases just like this. Look, a lot of those people thought, I think stupidly as it turned out, but thought, hey, the left went crazy all through the summer. They went completely crazy and they burned down cities, they smashed stores, they did all kinds of violent stuff. They weren't punished, so why should we be? They did not account for the unequal application of the law. So I think that was their mistake. I also think that like every poll, I know how hard the media and the left has tried to push January 6th as that's the most horrible thing in the world, a terrible assault on our democracy, and it's worse than 9/11 and blah, 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 blah. But nobody believes it. Everyone thinks that this argument is totally full of shit. And
Okay,
yeah,
okay, let's
and we
put
saw
that for me.
and the election, not only does the election bear it out, but every public poll bears it out. Look for any poll on what people think about January 6th, and you'll get the reaction back. We don't care. You guys have completely oversold this.
I listened to your interview in The Blaze, and I would be interested to hear how you understand when Jill Savage, the journalist, said, America is capitalism plus scripture. What do you make of that?
I don't want to put words in her mouth.
That's a quote.
I don't want to second guess what she has to say. I would interpret it one way and she may interpret it a different way, but I'm not going to touch that one.
Maybe you can tell me, capitalism, yeah, it's a given, right? How important is religion in America?
I think it's very important
Mhm.
as a unifying concept. This country was founded by very religious people. The founders were not necessarily Orthodox practicing religious, but the bulk of the American people was certainly towards the more religious side. And it goes back to the earliest days of America, even before 1776. Tocqueville made a point to talk about the religiosity of Americans. I think you can take religious or scripture or any one of these words and synonymize it with virtue and righteousness. Like John Adams said, this Constitution, this form of government is for a virtuous people and it's not fit for another. So I think the place of religion in American society, American politics has always been very strong, but it's not necessarily sectarian. From the very beginning, we had no state churches. And that was a kind of very deliberate thing that was in opposition to England. It was opposition to France and many other places, not to mention in the Middle East. And we are generally religious, but it's not necessarily a sectarian thing. And I believe that. I don't think there's a scenario where you can have a completely a-religious people and still have a functioning liberal democratic society for the long haul. I just don't think it's possible.
So when we touch on that topic of ethics and religions and the history of the US, I can't not mention what happened to the Native American and to slavery. How do you think America can reconcile that? Or does it need to be reconciled?
I really don't think it needs to be reconciled. These things happen. This is the history of the world. Slavery is not unique to the United States by any means. It is thankfully an extinct artifact of human civilization. It's something that was present with us from our earliest days. You could say that it's an artifact of a certain type of agrarian system that becomes obsolete once you have the Industrial Revolution. The truth is that slavery existed through most of history in every country. And we ended it in 1865. And the constant harping on it as if we still have slavery or as if slavery is a sin that this country can't wash away. It's a sin that every other country, every other civilization can seem to wash away, but the United States can't. Why? Because reason. I think the constant harping on it serves to delegitimize the United States, which is the intended agenda, and frankly, to put races at one another's throats. And it does that very well. When I grew up, race relations were far better than they have been. And the Obama years were when we first started to see racial riots for the first time since 1968. we started to see more animosity building in Black communities against white communities. After that, you saw the proliferation of anti-racism and all kinds of other nonsense that has the intended effect of putting us at each other's throats. I don't think these things need to be reconciled. I think the United States has done a far better job than most in dealing with the legacy of slavery, the legacy of racism. I'm very glad that things like Jim Crow are far in the past. But right now, the constant dwelling on it does more harm to some of these communities. It does more harm to the Black community than it does to me or folks who are white or of a different race. I would like to see us go back to the 80s and the 90s in terms of this attitude. And in regards to the Native Americans, it's a complicated issue. We should start talking about the indigenous peoples of every country. It's very interesting that it's just the United States where this is a going concern. The fact of the matter is, through history, these are the things that happen. You have conquests and migrations, and then to rewind 500 years to establish the original sin of the United States and the irredeemable original sin of the United States as being either slavery or the treatment of Native Americans. I think that's a very clear political agenda. Going back to the political warfare point, it's absolutely political warfare, and it's not on the level.
Talking of political warfare, I read, and I don't know if it's true, that you work for Viktor Orban. Did you work for Viktor Orban?
No, I represented the Hungarian government. You could say that it was for Orban, who was the prime minister, but I worked for the Hungarian government. Yes.
And what did you
I tried to give them some good press. That's basically it. My job was to let American conservatives know about some of the things that Hungary was doing that they would like, and to build bridges between Americans and Hungarians who see eye to eye on some political issues.
Yeah, and as I was preparing this interview, I realized that Hungary, since at least 2022, has been really extremely active in drawing American, but not just American, worldwide conservators to Hungary, developing close ties with, in France, Marine Le Pen, in the US, Trump, and more. So what do you think is interesting for conservators in Hungary? What makes Hungary a focus point?
It's many things. If you go to Budapest today and you go to Amsterdam tomorrow, or Paris or London, you see very different things in little ways and in big ways. For example, Hungary committed the unforgivable sin of saying, no, we are a country, we're a small country, and we are controlling our borders. We're not bringing in as many refugees from Syria or who knows where to overwhelm our societies. We're a small country with a small population. We don't have that much money. We don't want it for the simple reason that we know we can't assimilate these people, and we know that we can't pay for this. I think that's the main reason why many American conservatives look to Hungary and they like what they see. Consequently, when you visit Budapest, it's a safe city. A woman can go walking in the middle of the night in Budapest and not have to worry about horrible things happening to her, such as what happens in most of Western Europe. Hungary is pushing back against this tide of homogenization throughout much of the West, specifically throughout the EU. Many American conservatives appreciate that. It's important for a distinct people to have their own space, to have their own country, to be able to make their own laws. You saw this expressed in terms of Brexit and in other places too. Sovereignty is very important. And Hungary has been very strong in asserting and trying to maintain its own sovereignty as a country that's not very powerful economically, militarily, or population-wise. They're pushing back against a tremendous tide. And a lot of American conservatives appreciate that.
Thank you. I would really love to have your take on Elon Musk as being an advisor to Trump.
Elon Musk as an advisor to Trump.
Elon Musk and the role of big business.
The role of big business. I'm not sure if that's really an applicable question, because within big business, you have people who are very ideologically globalist left George Soros types on one hand. On the other hand, you have people like Elon Musk who have completely different opinions. So I think it's misleading. It comes down to what people believe. But about Musk, I think he is an indispensable influence on Donald Trump, specifically when it comes to choosing some of the folks for cabinet and other appointees for his government. If there's one thing that Elon Musk knows how to do well, it's to find smart, competent people who will execute in his absence. He runs a number of companies, and the success of any one of those companies depends on having someone at the top who knows what they're doing and who has his trust, an intelligent, competent person who can manage these things. I think that Donald Trump has always had difficulty with that particular aspect of evaluating people. He's more apt to go and find someone who is good on TV. And a friend of mine said that Trump isn't staffing his administration, he is casting it, which is to say that someone kind of looks and acts the part and he likes them. That person's ability to actually do the job well is a secondary consideration. And I think for Elon, as we've seen reported, I've heard things and the press has heard things about Elon pushing back on some of the cabinet possibilities. He'll sit down with someone and in a few minutes understand if this person possesses some competence or intelligence. I think he's a tremendous asset at this point. This is something that goes beyond ideology. There was the old red Chinese saying is someone is either red or expert. So are they politically aligned or are they an expert? Do they have expertise? You want a red expert. Depending on the job, if you only have one, you go with one or the other, but ideally you want the combination of both. Hopefully that kind of person makes it through more often than the others.
Finally, the question I always ask in this podcast is, what is America to you?
That's a very big question. That's a big question because there's an emotional component to it. There's a familial component to it, an intellectual one. It's hard to answer because the possible answers are so great. Everything from America being the last hope of mankind to it being the great experiment in freedom that had never been tried before and has been more successful here than anywhere else. You have that on one hand. And of course, I've always been an American patriot and someone who has a great deal of reverence for the American founding. As someone who does have a great deal of reverence for the American founding, the ways in which America falls short today of that founding and is definitely a concern. Look, I think we're a great country. I think we're a great people. The American people are wonderful, not perfect by any means, but some of the best people that I would hope to find. And I always think about the Churchill quote, America is going to do the right thing after it exhausts all other options. And I think that describes us perfectly.
Thank you, David.
All right. Thank you much.